Hey guys, what's up? It's Alec Torelli. Welcome back to an episode of the Hand of the Day brought to you by Conscious Poker. This hand comes from the Triton Super High Roller £1 million buy-in tournament, biggest tournament in history, coming up on the Hand of the Day.
Hand of the Day.
Before we jump in, if you're new to this channel, Conscious Poker is the best place to take your poker game to the next level with awesome hand reviews from all the key hands around the world, as well as hands I play on major events like Live at the Bike, Poker Night in America, as well as the opportunity to ask me anything. Feature new content here every week. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. For now, though, let's jump in. This hand kicks off with 60 120k blinds with a 120k ante and 8 players left in the event. So there's going to be some ICM considerations here, tournament final table strategy at play. Now we don't have footage from the pre-flop segment here, but what we know is that Big Al limps from under the gun. You can see here he limps, and then Dan Smith calls in the cutoff for 120k with pocket fives. Over to Adams now in the small blind, wakes up with 2 9s, who goes for a very big raise here, 760,000. You can see here it's about 6x. Now, if you look at some of what the solvers are doing these days, you'll see that in out of position, they really favor a large raise sizing. And I believe that's because, well, we don't know for sure. It seems like it's because they want to cut down dramatically on their opponent's implied odds calling in position. And because when you raise out of position, your range is typically narrower, because you have such a good incentive to just call and see the flop, that you have very strong hands, and when you have very strong hands, you want to put a large amount of money in the pot. So I really like this raise size from Adams. It's very in line with what the latest trends are in the poker community, and I think going big here makes sense. You don't want to make it like 400k, which is like a typical raise size in tournaments, about that proportional size, 3x or something, and then it just goes call, and now you have 9s, you're out of position against 2 people, you don't really know where you're at, there's not a lot of favorable flops, and you put yourself in a very tough spot. So I love this raise size here. Over to Big Al. I could see kind of limping under the gun here. I probably wouldn't really have a limping strategy that often. I would probably just raise or fold, but I could see having a limping strategy, and if you do have one, ace-3 suited makes sense. This is a good hand to limp with. You could balance that out with a limp re-raise. You can limp with some strong hands. You typically want to limp with hands that play very well post-flop, especially if you're going to be limping from early position. Facing this raise from a good solid pro, I might just let it go, especially because you might have Smith call behind you, or maybe even rejam some small percentage of the time and deny you some equity, making the hand tougher to play. I guess if you are sure Smith's going to fold and you could call and get the pot heads up in position, it's a decent spot, but these hands are tough to play post-flop, these ace-3 suited types of hands, so I probably would just let this one go. As played, he calls, Smith gets out of the way, and we go heads up to the flop. With a pot of 1.9 million, the flop comes down Jack 6-4 with 2 diamonds. Great flop for both players. When you have 9s, 1 overcard. If he doesn't have a jack, you're very likely ahead. And of course, flopping the nut flush draw is huge. Out of position with 2 9s, I think here we have a very clear bet. This flop is favorable to our range. Against a limp calling range, we're very likely to have the best hand, and we do benefit dramatically from protection with 9s against something like Queen 10 or King Queen. And so I think betting here is very important for protection and to deny some equity and hopefully to get called by a worse hand as well, which you can very conceivably do. Flush draws can call, 7s, 8s can call, 5s, maybe 3s or deuces, maybe 6x. There's a lot of worse hands that can call here with on this board. As for sizing, I like Adams' decision to go small here. That allows your opponent to call with a lot of worse hands. One thing I like a little bit less about going small here in this spot, I see he bets 450k. I might go something like 600k. Closer to a third of the pot. I think about a fourth of the pot is better when you're in position, because even if you do get floated with some like 2 overs type of hand, you still play the pot in position. You control the tempo of the hand, you can get the showdown, you have a lot easier of decisions. Whereas when you're out of position against an aggressive player like Big Al, you don't really know where you're at. Maybe he's going to read your bet as weak, maybe he's going to float, maybe he's going to bluff raise. This bet size just puts you in a potentially really tough spot later on in the hand. As played, he makes it 450k over to Big Al, who can really go either way here. As long as he doesn't fold, he's not making a mistake. But of course, you're wondering, which play has the highest EV. With something like ace-3 here of diamonds with the nut flush draw specifically, I think you could make a case for raising here, and if you do end up getting it in, fine. But the reason that I would favor that play more in a vacuum or in a cash game is just because you're always going to be in a favorable spot raising here with the nut flush draw. If your opponent does have an overpair or does have a lower flush draw, he might jam as well, so sometimes you get it in good. I'm not sure about in a tournament like this with 8 people left is just taking a higher variance line when if you just call, realize your equity, you could maybe get away from the hand or only put money in if you hit a very strong hand and preserve your chips and allow other players to bust who are shorter than you. So that's something that you have to consider in a tournament because you make more money as people bust, you move up the pay ladder, that you don't have to consider in a cash game where you're only worried about your direct equity. So I'm okay with Al calling here. It totally makes sense. I think it's in line with final table tournament strategy. He calls, and let's take a turn. With a pot of 2.8 million, the turn comes down a 6 of hearts, and I think here 9s would be a sort of like a classic check. The board paired, your opponent could have a 6, the jack now beats you, and it's a spot where you're either way ahead or way behind. With 1 card left, even if your opponent has a big draw like ace-3 is one of the biggest draws he can have, you're still pretty far ahead of that hand. And if you're behind with 9s, you're very far behind. If he has a jack, you're very bad shape, a 6, you're just straight drawing to a 9. So I think in spots like that where equities are very distributed, polar, like you're either way ahead or way behind, and there's 1 card to go, it's a typical spot where you'd want to see a check, maybe call 1 bet, maybe even check fold if you have a strong read, maybe check call the turn and check fold the river. It's like the typical line you see here. As played, though, Adams opts to bet this spot, which I think against a limping range might make more sense. When someone limp calls, their range is a little bit wider. There's a lot more... Their range is a lot narrower. You can pinpoint down where they're at more likely, and a lot of those hands that you beat, like 7s, 8s, 5s, are much more likely in their range than in any other random situation when you can't narrow down their range because they limp called under the gun. So I'm okay with betting here. It also does make the hand easier to play. You maybe do charge flush draws as well. And when you choose a sizing like 575, you have to understand you're pricing a flush draw in here. If someone has the nut flush draw, they have an overcard and a flush draw, they're getting a great price. They're going to call you again. So while I understand this bet and it does get some value, it does get some protection, you're still putting yourself in a tough spot by betting here this small out of position, especially against a player like Al who might read this as weakness, might decide to make a move, might float you again. It's just a kind of a tough spot. So I could see the profitability in it, but I think having a plan when choosing a bet size like this makes a lot of sense to me. Over to Big Al, who had a decision on the flop between calling and raising, but here I think he has a very clear slam dunk call. In this spot, you don't want to be raising on the turn when the board is paired. What are you repping by raising? You're really only representing a 6. A lot of times you're going to just call with a 6. So I don't really see him having any raising range here at all. I think calling makes a lot of sense. You realize your equity. There's 1 card to go. Your opponent showed a lot of strength by betting the flop and the turn. You're more likely to be up against a made hand. Don't really want to be raising here and going for a bluff in this spot. I love his decision to call. Let's take a river. With a pot of 4 million, the river pairs the board a 4. And now here, Adams has a super clear check. You're not protecting anything. You're not denying equity from anything anymore. So here you want to just check and get to showdown. I think also betting, you're really only hoping to get a crying call from something like 5s, 7s, and 8s. And it's just too thin. That doesn't outweigh the times that you're going to get called by a jack. Maybe those hands even fold or get called by a 6 or raised by a 6 or a 4. So I think Adams here has a very clear check, maybe even looking to call and pick off some bluffs depending on your read, how big he bets, and those sorts of things. Over to Big Al now, who jams all in literally 1 second, like basically just insta-shoves after Adams checks. And so in that spot, based on his, exploitative, like using an exploitative read here, I think we have to give him a very, very polar range. He's either going to have hands like 6x or a bluff. I don't even think 4s are necessarily part of his range here for shoving. I don't think a 4 is a bad shove on the river. I think, don't get me wrong, I think if you have a 4 here on the river and you opt to shove, it's fine. You pretty much always have the best hand, like 99% of the time have the best hand, and you can get value from a hand that's check calling, like a jack or queens, kings, aces, 10s, 9s. I think a 4 is a fine shove. But when someone shoves this river 8 people left in a huge tournament in this spot in 1 second. They didn't even think about what to do with a 4. I think it becomes even more likely that they either have the nuts, which is just straight up a 6, or a bluff. And typically when you see these very quick actions in big spots, it's a sign of weakness. So Big Al shoves here, which is not a play I hate. He's not going to wind up on the river with a lot of bluffs, and you have to have some bluffs here on the river to balance out the times you have a 6 and a 4. I would just think about it a little more. I do like this the decision to make an all-in bet, though. If you're going to bet this river, you're only representing a 6 or a 4. You're never really going to bet this river with a jack. It's just too thin. You can easily get check called by a hand that's trapping, like ace jack, king jack, or queens, kings, aces, that's just playing it on defense on the river. So even if Big Al has like king jack, he's probably not going to bet this river here for any size. So I think when he does bet the river, just the mere fact that he's betting means he either has a 6, a 4, or air, and when your range is very polar like that, you should be shoving. Your 6s want to shove, your 4s want to shove, your bluffs want to shove, so a shove is a great bet. I just wish he took a second longer. So over to Adams here on the river, who's in a very sick spot. A lot to consider here on the river. First and foremost, you want to look at your stack, how much you have left, 3-4 million, and you want to evaluate if this is the right time to use those chips. So you want to think about, what options do I have if I fold? How many big blinds will I have? Where is that in relationship to the other stacks? And those are things that are the nuances to final table tournament strategy that go beyond just the value of your hand, just beyond your equity, just beyond whether or not you have the best hand. So those are some of the things that we're going to kind of beyond the scope of this video that I talk more about that in the membership at Conscious Poker, final table tournament strategy, those sorts of things. I actually review all the hands I played during the WSOP main event, talk a lot about tournament strategy. If you want more about that, click the link below. But for now, we're just going to talk about the merit of his actual decision here. So the first thing you want to think about is you want to give your opponent a range, right? You want to go through what I call my 4-step process to make decisions. You want to give your opponent a range. Then you want to figure out what hands you beat and what hands you don't beat, right? So within the range you gave them, you want to sort of look at it and say, okay, these are the hands I beat, these are the hands I don't beat. After that, you want to calculate your pot odds, which here is basically 2-1, which means you need 33% equity to justify calling. Then you want to weigh those options in step 4 and say, okay, do I have 33% equity in this hand? Am I likely to have the best hand 33% of the time? I actually love doing these spots in the lab, which I do a lot of in the membership as well. And I actually go in and go through the math of the hand. So if you take a look here at this screenshot, this is an example of Poker Cruncher, which is a program that shows you your equity versus your opponent's range. And I was very conservative here, meaning I gave Al. You can see all the hands highlighted here in yellow and green. I gave Al a lot of strong hands for value, like ace-6 suited, ace-4 suited, which I don't think he can even have that necessarily. I gave him pocket 4s. I gave him pocket 6s, all the combos of quads. I gave him 7-6 suited, which maybe he doesn't even limp preflop with that. 6-5 suited, he might not even limp preflop. And then I gave him some bluffs, right? All the flush draws that are going to also play the hand this way. And if you see here, your equity with 9s, especially 9s with no diamond, you don't block any of your opponent's bluffs, right? You have no removal. You have 56% equity. So 56% equity is plenty enough to justify calling here. Remember, you only need 33% or so. You're getting about 2-1. So your equity is greater than your break-even point. You should definitely be calling in this spot. And I think I was pretty conservative with his range here, and I think this is pretty accurate. I mean, some hands might be questionable in there, but the point remains that your equity is definitely big enough to justify calling here. So I think in this spot, it's a call. Let's take a look and see what Adams does.
He wasted no time. We didn't even know it was his turn yet.
Now, some players you might be thinking, this guy's got a flush draw or he's got pocket jacks. No. Big Alec, he can have 6-7, 6-8, 6-5, ace-6 suited. Even a 4, because when you bet small on a flop and you bet small on a turn, someone's got good odds. He's going to lay down.
What a bluff by Big Al. Shows it too.
Ooh, Alfred DeCarlo.
That is incredible.
Don't call him Big Al for nothing.
Big Al taking the kids to the streets. I gotta get some appreciation there from Timothy Adams.
Call. Actually, I think he almost shoved out a turn. We might have to play the videotape. I say, what would Rick do in this spot? Shove.
Adams, man, what are you doing? Of course, it's a lot easier to sit here in, outside and make YouTube videos when I could see the friggin' cards. But trying to be objective, I think it's a call. I could see why you would fold at a final table of a tournament. Obviously, there are better spots. Hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. More awesome content is coming from the Triton High Roller Series and other awesome tournaments, high-stakes games around the world. Stay tuned at Conscious Poker.